The grand, majestic hotel gleamed with opulence, a fortress of wealth and power. Tonight, Khalid Al-Hassan, real estate mogul, billionaire, was the king of it all. But as the world's elite celebrated his latest triumph, an unexpected collision was about to change everything. A single spill of wine, a quiet child's words, and suddenly, Khalid's empire would face its greatest challenge, not from rivals, but from the truth he had spent his life avoiding. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. I'd be happy to see where you're tuning in from. The grand, majestic hotel gleamed under the soft, warm glow of crystal chandeliers, their intricate designs casting dazzling reflections across the ballroom. The air was thick with the sound of champagne glasses clinking, punctuated by the hum of conversation that echoed off the marble floors. Velvet curtains, deep burgundy, framed the panoramic windows that overlooked the skyline of Dubai. A light breeze stirred the luxurious drapes, but inside, the world was still, the room saturated with an energy that only true wealth could command. This wasn't just a party, it was a statement. The air itself seemed to shimmer with the weight of success, with each high-profile guest adding to the extravagance. The finest designers, the wealthiest investors, and the most influential political figures in the Middle East filled the space. They mingled in their bespoke suits and glittering gowns, moving as though they belonged to a different, untouchable world. At the heart of it all stood Khalid Al-Hassan. His empire had taken years to build, each stone laid with the precision of a man who understood the mechanics of power. A billionaire real estate mogul, Khalid had never known the struggle for survival that most people faced. His wealth wasn't a fortune, it was a command over lands, companies, and governments. His latest triumph, the $4 billion real estate deal that would further solidify his company's dominance across the Middle East, was the kind of victory that kept his name at the top of Forbes lists year after year. Tonight, the lavish decor, the golden table settings, and the designer attire were all part of his curated image, a reflection of success so grand that it almost seemed untouchable. The soft strains of classical music flowed through the room as waiters, dressed in crisp white uniforms, weaved through the crowd, serving delicate appetizers and expensive wine to the elite. It was a spectacle, a celebration of Khalid's latest conquest. He was the centerpiece, effortlessly commanding the attention of every guest. Khalid Al-Hassan was the very embodiment of confidence. Tall, sharply dressed in a bespoke black suit that gleamed faintly under the chandeliers, he moved with the ease of a man accustomed to power. Every gesture, every movement, seemed calculated. The way his hand traced the rim of his wine glass, how he adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate precision, these were the signs of a man who had mastered the art of influence. His dark brown eyes gleamed with the kind of self-assurance only a person who had seized power could possess. He spoke with authority to the businessmen around him, weaving tales of economic growth and market strategies that held his audience captive. He was a master of conversation, effortlessly dominating discussions about the newest acquisitions, mergers, and investments. Each word he spoke was not just a piece of information, it was a performance. He spoke about profits with the ease of someone who had made billions and could make billions more with just the next deal. Around him, the crowd listened. Investors, political figures, and moguls admired him not just for his success, but for his mastery in keeping the world around him in motion. The hum of conversation was always directed toward him, always circling back to the brilliance of his latest success. His smile, calculated, charming, never faltered. He was used to being the center of attention. Tonight, as always, he basked in the admiration that came with his success, perfectly aware of the eyes that followed his every move. The night was his, and everyone knew it. But beneath the facade, something lay dormant in Khalid. It wasn't something he often acknowledged, but there was a weariness that followed his every step, an underlying sense of dissatisfaction, as though no matter how much wealth he accumulated, it would never be enough to fill the space he'd carved out for himself. He had achieved what most could only dream of, but there was always more to conquer. That hunger for more, the drive to be the most powerful, was what kept him moving, kept him at the top. In stark contrast to Khalid stood Yasmin, a small, unnoticed figure among the glittering crowd. She moved quietly between the guests, balancing an empty tray with the kind of concentration only a child accustomed to invisible labor could have. Her faded apron, too large for her small frame, hung loosely around her shoulders. Unlike the finely dressed guests in their silk gowns and tailored suits, Yasmin's clothes were second-hand, worn at the edges, a silent testament to the life she led. She had been brought to the hotel by her mother, a housekeeper who worked tirelessly to make ends meet. Tonight, Yasmin had been given the rare opportunity to accompany her mother during the gala. It wasn't a treat, but a necessity. Yasmin had learned early in life how to remain invisible in spaces like this, spaces where the divide between wealth and poverty was as clear as day and night. This was the only way she could help her mother, by quietly carrying trays and clearing glasses, her small hands gripping the edges with an intensity that belied her age. She knew how to move between the tables without drawing attention, how to avoid crossing the path of the elite, and how to stay out of their way. Her mother, working multiple jobs just to make sure Yasmin had a roof over her head, had pleaded with the hotel manager to let her bring Yasmin along. She had promised Yasmin would be quiet, that she would stay in the back room and do her homework. But promises born out of desperation were often broken. And so, Yasmin found herself here, in a room full of powerful people who never noticed her, who never saw the exhaustion in her mother's eyes or the effort it took to survive on the wages they earned. Tonight was just another night of survival, but Yasmin couldn't help but observe the excess around her. The laughter of the guests seemed hollow to her, a sharp contrast to the silence of her own life. She noticed the way they laughed too loudly, wasted food, and discussed matters that meant nothing to her. She noticed the wine, which could feed her family for a month, being poured freely into glasses as though it were nothing more than a decoration. Yasmin didn't resent them. She couldn't afford resentment. She only saw the world for what it was, a place where some people had everything and others had nothing. But as she carefully balanced her tray, weaving through the crowd, she didn't realize that the worlds of privilege and survival were about to collide, and her life was about to change in a way she could never have imagined. The night continued to hum, with the sounds of clinking glasses and murmurs of admiration. Khalid Al-Hassan moved with calculated grace through the ballroom, weaving between dignitaries and moguls, each conversation a smooth step in the intricate dance of power. He was the maestro of this symphony, orchestrating every word, every gesture with the precision of someone who had mastered the art of influence. His eyes gleamed with self-assurance, his voice steady as he discussed market strategies with a fellow investor. "These acquisitions are just the beginning," Khalid said, his hand casually lifting his glass of wine to punctuate the point. "In a few years, we'll dominate the entire region. Our influence will stretch from the heart of the Middle East to Europe." The glass, filled with a deep red wine from the year 1982, shimmered under the chandeliers as Khalid's finger traced the edge of the crystal. It was a wine so rare and valuable that it was a symbol of the luxury that surrounded him. As he leaned forward, gesturing animatedly, his words flowed as easily as the liquid in his hand, carrying the weight of a man who had everything to gain and nothing to lose. Unbeknownst to him, Yasmin Fadl had silently entered the scene, her small hands gripping the tray she carried with the practiced care of someone who had spent more time cleaning than playing. She weaved through the crowd with caution, her steps light and measured, careful not to draw attention to herself. Her faded apron hung loosely around her small frame, a stark contrast to the finely tailored suits and designer gowns that surrounded her. Yasmin's eyes darted between the guests, absorbing everything, each laugh that seemed to echo off the marble walls, each whispered deal that floated above her head like a foreign language. She had learned long ago to blend into the background, to remain unnoticed, to survive by being invisible in a world where she didn't belong. Tonight, however, was different. She could feel the unease creeping up her spine as the weight of the night's extravagance pressed in on her. The tray, laden with empty wine glasses, seemed too large for her small hands, but she managed. Step by step, she moved with purpose, her worn shoes making no sound on the smooth floor. It wasn't long before she found herself crossing in front of Khalid, who was in the midst of explaining the finer points of his business strategy. The incident happened in a split second. As Khalid turned sharply to face another approaching guest, his wine glass arced through the air, following the motion of his hand, as though it were an extension of his power. But Yasmin, caught in the path of his movement, was in the wrong place at the wrong time. His hand brushed against her tray as he made the turn, sending the wine crashing down onto her small face. For a moment, the world stopped. The dark red liquid cascaded down Yasmin's face, soaking her thin sweater and staining her clothes. The fine wine, worth more than many families' monthly wages, dripped onto the floor, splattering across the marble in tiny pools of red. The room fell silent, a thick, suffocating quiet that seemed to linger in the air. The soft murmurs of conversation halted abruptly, replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. Then the nervous laughter began, first a light chuckle, then a ripple that spread through the crowd. The guests, uncertain of how to react, turned their attention to the small, frail girl standing before the billionaire. Khalid's heart skipped a beat. His mind, usually quick and decisive, ground to a halt as his eyes fixed on Yasmin. She stood frozen for a moment, the wine dripping down her face in thick streaks. But it wasn't the wine that shocked Khalid, it was the way she reacted. There was no panic, no frantic apology, no crying. Instead, Yasmin simply wiped the liquid from her cheek with the back of her small hand, her face expressionless but calm. Khalid's hand, still gripping his own glass, tightened reflexively. For a heartbeat, he didn't know what to do. His mind raced, calculating how the press would spin this incident, how it might appear in tomorrow's headlines. Would this be seen as a mark of his arrogance? Would it harm his carefully curated image? The thoughts came too quickly to form into anything coherent. He was used to being in control, to orchestrating every situation to his benefit, but this moment, this simple collision, was outside of his design. For a long second, Khalid did nothing. He just stared at Yasmin, who, despite the wine staining her clothes, didn't flinch or seem uncomfortable. The crowd's laughter continued to buzz around them, but Yasmin seemed impervious to it all. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was simply standing there, calm, almost regal in her silence. The silence around Khalid felt suffocating. This wasn't the reaction he expected. His guests, many of whom had seen him handle crises with a practiced hand, seemed to find this moment more awkward than anyone had anticipated. Some of them chuckled nervously, others shifted their weight uncomfortably, but Yasmin remained unmoved. As the laughter began to die down, Khalid finally found his voice, though it was not the magnanimous response he had planned. His tone, usually confident and self-assured, faltered as he looked down at the small girl before him. He started, unsure of how to proceed. His words trailed off as he looked into Yasmin's eyes. For a moment, he couldn't reconcile what he saw there. It was not the fear or submission he had expected from someone of her background. Instead, her eyes were steady, unblinking, as if she were looking right through him. Yasmin spoke then, her voice quiet but unwavering. "It's not the wine that's worth more than my family's rent," she said, her words cutting through the awkward murmur of the crowd. "It's what you choose to do with your wealth that defines you." The room seemed to hold its collective breath. The guests, who had been caught up in the spectacle of a wealthy man spilling wine on a poor girl, now found themselves unnerved by the weight of Yasmin's words. It wasn't just her calmness that shocked them, it was the simplicity of her wisdom, the clarity with which she saw the divide between the lives they led and the reality she endured. Khalid, who had made a career of navigating the complex webs of business and politics, now found himself at a loss. This child, drenched in wine, had just spoken a truth he had never truly confronted before. Yasmin didn't ask for pity, nor did she show any sign of the anger Khalid expected. She simply stood there, offering him a lesson in humility without even knowing it. The tension in the room thickened. Khalid's gaze remained locked on Yasmin, his mind racing to reconcile what he had just heard with everything he had spent his life building. For the first time, he felt something stir beneath his carefully constructed image, a crack, however small, in the persona he had worked so hard to create. And for the first time, he wasn't sure how to fix it. The room, once filled with the faint hum of polite chatter, now simmered in an oppressive silence. The noise, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, all of it had vanished, swallowed up by Yasmin's words. Her small, unassuming voice carried through the now still ballroom, cutting through the tension like a blade. "It's not the wine that's worth more than my family's rent," Yasmin said, her voice calm but resolute. She didn't flinch, didn't look away from Khalid's gaze, though her small body was drenched in the wine that had cost more than her family's monthly income. "It's what you choose to do with your wealth that makes you who you are." The words hung in the air, heavier than the wine-soaked fabric that clung to her frame. Khalid stood frozen for a moment, the weight of her simple, unfiltered honesty settling over him like a thick fog. His thoughts, usually sharp and quick, faltered. Here was a child whose life had been shaped by struggle, speaking a truth so fundamental that it made everything he had spent his life working toward seem distant, shallow even. For a brief, uncomfortable moment, no one in the room spoke. The guests, who had at first laughed nervously at the accident, now found themselves unable to respond. What could they say? Yasmin, in the middle of this glittering palace of wealth and excess, had just dismantled the very foundation upon which their world was built. It wasn't an accusation. It was simply a statement of truth. Khalid's mouth went dry. He had lived his entire life within the safe confines of calculated success. Every business move, every deal, every acquisition had been deliberate. He had amassed billions, built an empire that spanned countries, and surrounded himself with the best minds in the business world. Power, wealth, influence, they were the measures by which he defined his success. But here, in the simple words of a child, those same measures felt suddenly hollow. Yasmin's gaze did not waver from his. She had seen people like Khalid all her life, and yet her voice carried a quiet power. "My mama cleans these floors," she continued, her words cutting through the discomfort in the room with the sharpness of a knife. "But she doesn't get to sit at your tables. She doesn't get to drink wine like this, or wear clothes that fit." Her small face, streaked with wine, remained unmarked by fear or resentment. Yasmin was not angry, but there was a clear understanding in her words, an understanding of the world around her that no amount of wealth could shield Khalid from. She wasn't speaking to him out of spite or bitterness. She was speaking from the reality she had lived, from the struggles her mother had faced just to survive. "But she says we have more than we think, because we have each other," Yasmin added, her voice softening just slightly, as if she were offering something Khalid could never buy, something far beyond the reach of wealth. "That's what matters, isn't it? Not how much we have, but what we do with it." The words sank in like stones, rippling through the air and settling at the bottom of Khalid's chest. He swallowed hard, as if trying to push the discomfort back down. He had been so focused on creating wealth, on climbing higher, on beating the competition at every turn, that he had never once stopped to think about the lives his success had touched. Yasmin had never asked for this. She had never asked to be seen, to be heard. But here she was, offering a perspective that cut through the illusions he had spent years perfecting. The irony was not lost on him. She, a child dressed in hand-me-downs and stained clothing, was the one forcing him to confront something he had ignored for far too long: the human cost of his empire. Khalid's thoughts began to spiral, but in the midst of his internal chaos, he couldn't escape the truth of Yasmin's words. His entire life had been built on the idea that wealth was the ultimate measure of success, but this moment, this unintentional collision, was challenging that belief. Yasmin had spoken from a place of experience, of survival. Her mother, working tirelessly to support her family, had learned long ago that there was something more important than what money could buy. There was love. There was human connection. The room remained unnervingly still. Even the most powerful people in the room seemed to have been struck silent by the honesty of a child. Some of them, like Khalid, found themselves uncomfortably aware of their own complicity in the systems Yasmin had described, systems that kept people like Yasmin and her mother invisible, unnoticed, and unheard. Khalid wanted to say something, to defend himself, to rationalize away the growing unease in his chest, but he couldn't. Yasmin had stripped away the layers of justification he had built for himself, and in their place, a deep, gnawing sense of guilt settled in. His world had always been black and white, a matter of numbers and margins, but now, for the first time, he was seeing it in shades of grey. The silence in the room stretched, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was reflective. Khalid looked down at Yasmin, who still stood before him, her posture unshaken, her eyes not filled with anger but with a calm wisdom he could not ignore. He could feel the weight of her words pressing on him, forcing him to confront something far bigger than the billion-dollar deals he had spent his life negotiating. He had been wrong. For the first time in his life, Khalid found himself questioning everything he had stood for. He had thought success was defined by power, by wealth, by influence, but Yasmin had shown him otherwise. Success was about what you gave back, about how you used your position to lift others, not just to feed your own insatiable hunger for more. And the room, once filled with laughter and polite conversation, now seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't just Khalid who had been forced to face a harsh reality. The guests around him, Many of them titans of industry, political figures, and moguls, were now coming to terms with the same truth. They, too, had been blind to the cost of their success. They had been too focused on what they could acquire, never pausing to ask themselves how they could truly make a difference. As Khalid's gaze met Yasmin's, he knew that something had changed within him. He had built his empire with a focus on self-preservation and domination, but now he wondered, had he ever considered the lives of those his success had affected? And, more importantly, could he change? Could he, a man who had risen to the top by any means necessary, find a way to use his power for good? The weight of Yasmin's words lingered in the air, thick and unyielding. Khalid stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just unfolded. Everything he had worked for, his empire, his wealth, his undeniable success, seemed to evaporate in the face of the stark truth Yasmin had delivered. She had shattered the foundation he had built for himself, exposing the cracks beneath the surface that he had carefully hidden from others and, more importantly, from himself. His empire, constructed over years of grueling effort, felt suddenly meaningless. He had devoted his life to accumulating power, to controlling markets, and to expanding his reach, but at what cost? Yasmin, with her simple yet profound insight, had shown him that true success was not measured by wealth alone. It was about how that wealth was used, whether it helped others, whether it uplifted those who were left behind, or whether it simply perpetuated the systems that caused their suffering. Khalid felt the world shift beneath his feet as Yasmin's words echoed in his mind. For the first time, he began to question everything he had stood for. The numbers, the deals, the billion-dollar mergers, none of it seemed to matter now. All these years of meticulous planning, all these years of building an empire, and yet, in a room full of wealth and influence, it was the voice of a child, a poor child at that, who had given him the clarity he needed to see the truth. He felt a pang of guilt, a deep, gnawing sense of shame. He had never truly seen the lives of people like Yasmin. He had been blind to their struggles, to the invisible people who kept the world of luxury running. He had focused so much on the luxury, the power, the prestige, that he had forgotten the very thing that gave those luxuries meaning, the human connections that formed the foundation of every business, every transaction, and every victory. Khalid's gaze shifted, unfocused, as his thoughts began to spiral. The room around him, once a stage for his triumphs, now felt cold, distant. The wealth, the decor, the guests, all of it seemed to blur into a haze, as though none of it mattered. He had become so consumed with power that he had failed to see the bigger picture. He had thought that success was about building more, acquiring more, and dominating more. But now, in the silence of that ballroom, it felt like his success had been nothing more than a facade, hollow and shallow. His eyes flickered to Yasmin, still standing there, drenched in wine yet unwavering in her presence. She had spoken so plainly, so effortlessly, as if the wisdom in her words had been shaped not by textbooks or boardrooms, but by the life she had lived. The simplicity of her truth hit him harder than any corporate strategy, harder than any business deal ever could. For a brief moment, Khalid wondered if he could ever be the man she saw in him, the man who could make a difference, who could use his position not for personal gain, but for the good of others. His breathing slowed as he made a decision, one that seemed impossible but inevitable in that moment. With a deep, steadying breath, Khalid stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. He approached Yasmin slowly, carefully, as though unsure of his footing. His hands, which had long been accustomed to firm, calculated decisions, now trembled slightly, but he knew what he had to do. Kneeling before Yasmin was not something Khalid had ever considered, let alone actually done. Kneeling, in his world, was a sign of weakness, a gesture reserved for subordinates and servants. But as he lowered himself to her level, he realized that this act of humility was the very thing he needed. He was not just kneeling before a child. He was kneeling before the truth that had been staring him in the face all along. "I've spent my life trying to build something that lasts," Khalid said, his voice rough, his words slow and deliberate. "But I've never thought about the cost of that success. Yasmin, His throat tightened, and for a moment he struggled to find the words. He was used to being in control, to commanding respect from others, but now, in front of this child, his world felt unsteady, his certainty wavering. "I want to change," he continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. I can't keep going the way I have. We need to use our wealth to make a real difference, not just for us, but for everyone. The words were raw, unpolished, but they carried the weight of a decision he knew he could no longer avoid. He had been so focused on power, so intent on building an empire, that he had neglected the very purpose of his success. Yasmin had opened his eyes to something greater, a world that could be shaped by compassion, by fairness, by the understanding that wealth wasn't a tool to hoard but to distribute, to elevate, to empower. As he looked around the room, the silence from the guests was palpable. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, others avoided eye contact, but a few, moved by Khalid's sincerity, began to nod in quiet agreement. Khalid knew that this moment would change the course of his life, but it could also change theirs. "I will ensure that my wealth serves more than just my success," Khalid declared, his voice growing firmer, more resolute. "It will serve the people who need it the most. I'm going to refocus my business ventures. I'm going to use my power and influence to create real change, not just profits." The room had gone from silence to a deep, thoughtful quiet, the kind of quiet that signaled a collective reckoning. People who had spent their lives accumulating wealth were now forced to reckon with what they had built. Had they built it for their own comfort, for their own legacy, or had they built it for something greater? Yasmin and her mother, who had been quietly observing from the edges of the room, began to make their way toward the exit. Yasmin glanced at Khalid, her small frame standing straight and tall despite the chaos of the evening. For a moment, their eyes met. Khalid couldn't help but notice the strength in her gaze, a strength far greater than the wealth of any billionaire in the room. As Yasmin turned to leave, her mother's tired face was a testament to everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed. Khalid watched them go, his heart heavy with the realization of how little he had seen, how blind he had been. But as the door closed behind them, Khalid felt something else, a flicker of hope. The conversation had shifted. The night had begun with an accident, with an awkward spill of wine, but it had ended with a life-changing shift for Khalid, and perhaps for everyone who had witnessed Yasmin's words. As he stood up, his mind already racing with possibilities, he realized that this moment, this unexpected, uncomfortable moment, was the catalyst for a new chapter in his life. And it wasn't just about him. It was about using his power to create a future where people like Yasmin didn't have to fight for a chance at dignity, where the wealth he had worked so hard to accumulate could serve those who needed it the most. For the first time in his life, Khalid knew he had to do more than just succeed. He had to make sure that his success counted for something greater than himself. And that journey, he realized, was just beginning. As Khalid's journey shows, change begins with a single moment of clarity. Yasmin's simple yet profound words have the power to reshape the way we think about wealth and power. What will you do with the privilege and resources you have? Share your thoughts and reflections on how we can use our success to create a more just and compassionate world. Comment below and join the conversation about how small acts of awareness can lead to monumental change. If this story has inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because when we challenge the status quo, we can change the future.